Want to learn how to sew jeans faster but without skimping on the quality? Well, then watch this video where I share my top tips for speeding up your jeans making. And in case you're wondering, who am I? Well, I am Johanna Lundström, the author of the best-selling book Sewing Jeans, and I also have lots of tutorials here on YouTube where you can learn more techniques for making jeans. Now, let's start with my favorite tip, which is to sew as much as possible as a continuous seam, and that in particular is relevant to top stitching. I like to think of it as sewing everything like a rectangle. So what exactly am I talking about, you might wonder? Well, for instance, if you're sewing 2 rows of top stitching, which I'm showing here on the back pockets, then you don't sew 2 rows and then back stitch them. No, instead what you do is that you sew the entire seam as one continuous seam forming a rectangle. That means that you start and stop at the same space. You just overlap the stitches a little bit to secure. You can either shorten the stitch length or do a little bit of back stitching. But the cool thing, for instance, with the back pockets is that even though, yeah, you sew them as a rectangle, you're actually folding them inwards later on and top stitching. Another example where you can sew it as a continuous rectangle, or maybe it's more of a curved thing, is the top stitching on the front pocket. Again, you start here, you sew all the way up, you pivot, and then you sew the second row, pivot, overlap and finish. And then of course the ends where you overlap, those will be enclosed in the side seams. Brilliant, right? Another example where you can use this technique is when you're top stitching the yoke, because you're doing that before you sew the side seam and the back crotch, just a continuous seam forming a rectangular. And another area where you can sew it as a rectangle is the waistband, because technically, well, you also stitch that as a rectangle, even though it's just 1 row of stitching. So you start here inside the waistband at the fly, because it's nice to have that intersection where the seam starts and ends hidden underneath the fastening. So you start here and then you sew all the way around, all the way up to this edge, sew all the way back down and finish at the same spot. Simple, right? And I'm going to give you a more advanced tips now, is that you can also attach some pieces, sewing them as a continuous seam. And the best example of that is the back pockets, because then when you're attaching those to the back leg of the jeans, you again start and finish at the same time. So this is how it works. I'm going to try to explain it. So what you do is you start at the outer seam of one side of the pocket, and then you stitch all the way down along the outer edge, and when you reach the other side to top, you pivot, stitch down all the way the inner seam, and then you reach the upper edge, you overlap to secure and finish, usually we're shortening the stitch length. Now of course for security it's also good to add bar tacks after you've done this, but the benefit of this method is that there's only one point where you need to secure the thread, which makes this technique not just faster, but it also makes the pockets more durable. And you can use the same technique if you are applying a key pocket on one of the sides on the jeans. So you start here and then you sew all the way along the lower edge, sew all the way around, overlap. And by the way, this illustration and tutorials are from my course Denim Master, which is a course about how to make your own jeans from start to finish. And if you're curious about that course, you can check out the link in the description section of this video to learn more. Another time-saving tip is to leave edges raw. And the edges, that is obviously the edges of the fabric pieces that you cut when making jeans. Now, not all edges should be left raw, but the ones you can leave raw are the ones that are being enclosed inside other seams. For instance, the waistband and the waistline, because those are enclosed inside the waistband and then top stitched over and over. You see the waistband is also interfaced, which again prevents from unraveling. So there's absolutely no need to overcast the edges with a zigzag stitch or serger stitch. That will just waste thread and waste time, so skip that step. Another example where you don't have to overcast is when you're hemming the jeans, because again you're doing a double fold, and because you're top stitching over, there's no risk of the threads unraveling. It's nice and secure, and it's not just a way of saving time. This is actually the standard method for making jeans, so you're not doing anything wrong if you're skipping the steps in the example that I show you. Another area where you can skip overcasting is when you're sewing the pocket opening, because again you're folding this twice and top stitching over. Here we've even done 2 rows, so it's very, very secure, so you definitely do not need to add any more bulk to that area. And if you're doing a nice French seam pocket lining where that first edge is enclosed inside the other row when you're stitching over it, you do not need to overcast. So here I've shown a couple of things where you can definitely save time, and I'm also going to give you a little bit more of advanced tips where you can also skip overcasting, and this is where the edges will be top stitched to secure. A good example of this is again the back pockets. So if you look inside here, you will see a little bit of fraying, but don't worry, it's top stitched with 2 rows, and if you look into any ready-made jeans, you will see that they have not finished the edges either. They left these rows. Now, of course, if you feel like it, you can definitely serge along the edges. Do you? But you definitely don't have to, because it's nice and secure with the double top stitching. The same goes for the belt loops. They are being top stitched, and you usually use bar tacks to attach them. So again, plenty of stitching to prevent the fabric from unraveling. So I never overcast the edges of the waistband. Again, you can check out any ready-to-wear jeans and you will see that they are doing the same thing. So you're in good company if you make this little bit of a time-saving shortcut. Now let's talk a little bit about batching. That's another way to save time and also make the workflow a little bit more pleasant. For instance, if you're top stitching, you can usually do several pieces at the same time, so you do not have to switch back thread and needle. Because one struggle that we have when we're making jeans on our regular home sewing machine is that we need both different type of threads, different type of colors, different type of needles, depending on what part of the jeans we are making. So it's a lot of going back and forth. But one way is to figure out all the pieces you can sew at the same time, and this can be a little bit hard to figure out. And I think in the beginning, if you're making your first pair of jeans, it does make sense to do everything in a specific order. I mean, start with the front pockets, then the zipper. There is a way of doing jeans the right way. But when you feel a little bit more comfortable, you can definitely start batch sewing everything from serging to top stitching. And if this is feeling a little bit confusing and overwhelming and a little bit too much to figure out, don't worry, because I have created a download guide that is free, so you can keep that for reference at your sewing table so that you know which things you can do at the same time. A link to that is pinned in the comment section of this video and also in the description section. So grab that guide to make batch sewing a bit easier. Another time-saving tip, which isn't really about sewing, is more about organization, is to keep everything in place. Because let's be honest, having to look for missing needle, threads, notions, that's a huge time suck. So what I like to do is that I use one of these. This is like a metal tin that you can get when you buy certain type of candies, and in there I store all the things that I need for making jeans, for instance. So here I have thread, I have a hump jumper, I have different type of needles, I have different type of press fit, all the things that I need to make jeans. And the trick here is not just to prep this before you start sewing jeans, it's also that as soon as you switch needles or switch thread, it has to go back in the tin. That's the main thing that you need to keep in mind. I hope that this makes sense to you, and doing this has just made my sewing life so easier. So any type of organization, strategy, would do what works for you, but I highly recommend that you have some kind of system when making jeans or just sewing garments in general, I guess. And speaking of overcasting, another time-saving tip is to overcast several layers at the same time, because some pieces of the jeans will not be pressed apart. For instance, on jeans, usually one side, the seam allowance is pressed open, usually the outer side, but it can also be the inseam, and then the other side is folded and in one direction and then top stitched over. So in those cases it makes no sense to serge both these sides separately. Instead, you first stitch the seam, you sew the seam with the raw edges, and then you overcast using a serger, overlock stitch or a zigzag stitch, and then you top stitch it in place. So the obvious area where you can do this is the back crotch, the yoke, and as I mentioned, the inseam or the outer seam, depending on what style of jeans you are making. So again, saving thread, saving time, brilliant, right? Another method that's similar to bat sewing but with a twist, and that is to chain piece. And this method is very common in the garment industry. It's basically where you do not stop after you've sewn one piece. Instead, you just insert the second piece and keep on sewing. And you do that until all the pieces are finished. And we are talking now about pieces that doesn't have to be secured properly, because they are going to be enclosed inside other seams, for instance the inseams or the crotch area. So a couple of examples of this. One very simple way of doing chain piece is when you're serging the edges. Instead, when you're finished, for instance, one front crotch, just insert the other front crotch and keep on serging, and other areas where you just have to keep on going. And you can also use this, for instance, when you're top stitching or stitching a single row. For instance, when you're sewing jeans, you're attaching the pocket shield to the pocket lining. So instead of securing the pocket shield, once you've done the first one, you just insert the second pocket shield and keep on sewing, and you don't have to worry about unraveling, because again, the edges of the pocket and the pocket shield, they will be enclosed both inside the waistband and the side seam. Now, of course, I totally understand if this feels a little bit risky. So what you can do is that at the end, you can either decrease the stitch length a little bit or back stitch a little bit, and then moving forward before you insert the second piece. I mean, just do what feels most comfortable for you, but definitely try the chain piece. It's actually quite fun, and it's also nice to figure out which pieces when I'm sewing can I use the chain piece technique for. I hope that you found these ideas useful. You can also employ them, of course, for other type of sewing projects, not just jeans, but yes, but because jeans, well, they do tend to take a lot of time. It's definitely an area where I am looking on ways to sew more efficiently. And I really hope that you enjoyed this video, and I highly recommend that you check out my other videos on jeans making as well, where you can also learn some of the time-saving tips that I shared in this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Janne Lundström. Stay safe. Bye bye.